All right, so this is notes towards the Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. That's Fiber in the background, yawning and making various sorts of canine noises. This is Part 12, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis towards Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. And I have been adding in America to clarify the meaning of that last element in all of this, and the comparison that David makes between the events in Thebes that follow, right, the ritual contamination, which is performed, through the act of Oedipus, murdering his father, and the events that we see unfolding, from this period, 2016 to 2024, as our democracy disintegrates in the United States and seems to be in the process of being replaced by a form of fascism. And so where we are after not entirely a set of intermissions, but of further theoretical discussions involving the manner by which that narrative, because it involves memory, is always already somewhat a kind of collaging, and because it involves memory, is also always already a kind of reification, if we understand reification in the cognitive psychology sense, and not in the Freudian sense, or the post Freudian senses in which it's come to be used in various examples of literary and other theory, uses in other interpretive and hermeneutic domains involving critical theory and the various branches of psychoanalytic critical theory. But if we imagine it from a strictly cognitive psychological point of view, then narrative and storytelling is by necessity always already a matter of reification, and that reification is influenced by all sorts of elements in consciousness. And from a more strictly Freudian perspective, the way that the unconscious and subconscious may choose to omit or hide from, or elude, right, those aspects of the narrative that it might not wish to see, and in that sense, narrative storytelling activity, right, is informed just as much as any other aspect of our psychological life by those forces of internal repression and anxiety, in conjunction with and confluence with wish fulfillment fantasies and all that belong to both fear and desire. So that even if one isn't entirely conscious, right, of making decisions involving elisions or omissions, or emphasis, or spending a certain amount of exaggerated time, right, on a topic, that there are forces at work in the unconscious that provide motivations for those kinds of selections, and that becomes part of the cognitive aspect of the reification process as well, right? And because what we're trying to argue for is that a narrating is from the outset, right, invested as narrative in David Antin's terms of narrative, not as mere story, but as as having psychological relevance, to the life of the subject, who is doing the narrating, and that's always the case. And if that weren't the case, no one would bother to narrate, anything at all, right? And then, you will perhaps recall that the discussion got a little bit complicated because I tried to perform an argument that part of the way, the manner in which David Antin reifies and reorganizes the story, and by reorganize I mean he changes the order and the understanding in which it appears in Aristophanes' play The Smile of the Sphinx, and conflates and collapses and omits and organizes in a new fashion his own retelling of the story. I tried to argue that in part that's a result of David's failure to recognize the organization of the story, which is also a failure on Aristotle's part in his reading of the story, in the second part of Aristotle's Poetics, which is, of course, his take on comedy. And the reason that he's looking at this particular piece by Aristophanes is because it deals with, precisely the same subject, that is, the story of Oedipus, but in as it's told in comic form rather than in tragic form. And so I presented an argument that Aristophanes' play represents an Othisi, an Analipsi, and an Anavasi, for each of these following four characters, for Tiresias, for Laius, for the Sphinx, and for Oedipus. And understanding, that structure, provides a model and a scaffolding, for us to remember the telling of the story and the events. And if one fails, to understand the formal pattern and the scaffolding, one is left, essentially, without an architectural diagram, and that diagram, and in some ways, even if it's part of memory and not in front of us as a script, provides us with a means, right, of organizing and recollecting, through the structure that we understand, and as opposed to without it, drawing and grasping for the elements in this box of collage materials, right? The way that one would, take whatever it is that one is grasping for, out of a cookie jar or the contents of a box placed in storage, or if one were participating in some kind of game show and drawing a random number or message, right, from some container, and one would just put one's hand in there and arbitrarily, right, withdraw, whatever it is, whatever bit of information or object that one, felt under one's fingertips, and in a certain way, right, memory never does that. It never grasps arbitrarily, but it's not defined, by a biegetic function in relationship to the material in whatever box it's reaching into, whether that box is the story of Oedipus or the story of Odysseus returning to Ithaca, from Troy, or whatever that, or a story involving these multiple characters named Mary. Whatever story that is, memory doesn't reach into that box arbitrarily, but neither does it reach into that box as a kind of objective, right, and perfect recollection of the ordered elements of what belongs to the box, in a certain sense that it's always overdetermined, by its formal understanding of the story in question and the way that story unfolds. It's overdetermined by the unconscious and conscious motivations for telling the story to begin with. It's overdetermined by the impetus to clarify to the audience or the addressee, the meaning and intention of the story. It's overdetermined by whatever is motivating the ego, that drives the narrating subject to perform the storytelling in the first place. Whether that is an economic motivation, or a motivation for kind of adulation, or a motivation to recapture a moment of youth, that may have passed. Imagine, perhaps that in a story of the retelling of a narrative involving, many characters named Mary, that some of these Marys are young and beautiful, and perhaps the narrator isn't as not young and beautiful as she once was, and in the course, right, in the wish fulfillment fantasy that participates in the construction of the narrative, there is a return, to some idealized moment, either of ideal masculinity, or ideal, femininity, or even beyond that, of ideal eroticism that's now, engaged as a kind of, fantasy of performance or nostalgia, right? And so all of that, is built into the design of the articulation of the elements, right, that drive on, or motivate, the manner in which the elements are collected, and you could say that in narrating is never, simply a matter of creativity, even if it's even if you're dealing with a fiction, right? But it draws upon all of these elements of both one's own remembered story of personal life experience, and all of those stories and forms that belong to one's memory of tellings and narratings. So where we are, having, and then the other part of the interlude, that isn't really, an intermission or a digression, but a matter of completing, part of the intention, of our narrating, this story, to begin with, and our own motivations, but in talking about, right, the form of the othisi, the analepsy, and the anavasi, and using that form to account for and explain, and David's failure perhaps to grasp it, to account for the way that David reorganizes the story. Something interesting happened, and the form itself, the othisi, the analepsy, and the anavasi, seemed to cause me, the narrating subject of this discourse, a problem in recalling and remembering, the exact order and relationship of the othisi, analepsy, and anavasi to each one of the characters, and caused me to misremember, right, the order in which in which each of these characters, receive, their corresponding othisi, analepsi, and anavasi. And I had remembered and imagined it as existing in a one-to-one correspondence between the acts and the scenes. And I had imagined that that Act 1 belongs to Tiresias, which it does, and I had imagined that Act 2 belongs to Laius, which it does for the most part, and Act 3 to the Sphinx, and Act 4 for Oedipus. But I had misremembered in that distribution of a one-to-one correspondence between the various othisi, analepsi, and anavasi of each one of the four characters, that Tiresias's anavasi doesn't occur until the first scene of the fourth act, which belongs to Oedipus and is the act that precedes the action that occurs in Act 1, Scene 1 in Sophocles' version, Oedipus the King. And so, so that argument that I made, becomes, a little bit more complicated than it appears on the surface. If the argument being that, David misremembered and kind of misorganized, right? Misorganized the events as they occur, part of his understanding involved an analepsis to this moment in which we receive the information that Tiresias is deceiving, right? Is deceiving Laius, and he puts that prior to the scene in which we actually realize that Tiresias is deceiving Laius. And I argued that the reason he does that is because he doesn't grasp the formal structure of the piece. But then, something interesting happened, and I seemed to over-reify the formal structure of the piece, and I seemed to over-articulate that structure as having a kind of linear and one-to-one correspondence relationship between the scenes and the acts, and the way that the characters are distributed, their various othisi, analepsi, and anavasi. And so something interesting occurred there, in which David, who perhaps failed to grasp some of the formal elements of the piece, reorganized it, lacking that scaffolding. But my memory's failure was different, and I over-reified, one could say, the scaffolding itself by simplifying the way that it was distributed across the telling of the story, right? And it was distributed across the telling of the story. Like, imagine that. So you imagine the mistake that I made was I had remembered, like, say that you remember that something is constructed around the elements of phi in such a way that it is represented by the Fibonacci sequence, right? And so, if you don't know the Fibonacci sequence off the top of your head, I'll just articulate it, briefly and quickly. So, some numbers that correspond to the Fibonacci sequence as it approaches the ratio of phi. You can if you begin with 0, you have 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89, 144, and we'll stop at 144 because that's enough to keep in mind, right? All right, so one could remember that that some kind of narrative or some kind of storytelling involved those elements, but one could forget, that they were placed out of order, and that perhaps in Act 1 you encounter you encounter, let's not begin with. It gets complicated if you begin with 0 and 1 twice. But let's just begin with the 1 and say that you encounter in Act 1, 1 and 2 and 144 rather than 1 and 2 and 3. And then in Act 2, perhaps you encounter 5 and 8 and 13. And then, perhaps in Act 3, you encounter, again, like an asequal, an asequential, series of these Fibonacci numbers. Well, David's failure is a failure to remember the construction, as a or a failure to recognize the construction as a Fibonacci sequence, right? Analogously, because. And I say analogously because the Aristophanes is, in fact, has no relationship to a Fibonacci sequence, or at least my reading, I don't see in it, right? I don't see in it any relationship to the model of phi, as a ratio, and it wouldn't really make any sense for it to as a comedy, but in any case, it's an analogy, and so. Under the terms of this analogy, or this metaphor, then David's failure to recognize the organization belongs to his failure to perceive the element of phi working through this imaginary play that we've constructed in order to clarify the difference in the way that these problems of reification arise in his, ordering of the story, or failure to order the story in a bijective function as it exists in Aristophanes, and my failure to do so. And then, contradistinctively, my failure was a failure to recall that in addition to having this organization, that belongs to our understanding of the sequence phi as it's represented in the Fibonacci sequence. In addition to that, I had failed to remember that these numbers occur. The structure occurs out of order, and is not right. Is not a one-to-one correspondence that begins, 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89, 144, right? And both are in a sense, you could say, errors in memory, but they belong to different domains and different motivations and different levels of organizational problem solving, and all of that is important to the discussion, because the discussion is precisely about all of that. As right, a discussion and a discourse, titled Notes Towards a Metapoetics of Paranarratology. And okay, with all of that, at this point, we can return, to the story itself and the play itself and David's recounting of it. And the only thing I think that we need to recall is that Tiresias is there in front of Laius, and the stage, once again is split, into these two parts, and each part, has its separate backdrop, and that Tiresias has arrived there, right? By means and our understanding of how he arrived in the palace, right, was by means of movement, created, by the set designer of the backdrop and the painted backdrop and the settings that it represented, and that he's moved past these three female figures that all represent different proximities to the palace, and at that point we can return to the unfolding of the action itself. So now Tiresias is before Laius, and they begin their account and their warning. And they say, Laius, I have to inform you of something. They say, and David is recounting this now, and we're recounting David's recounting of this now. And they say, David says, they say, but he says he, or he says she, but we're going to have David say they. And David says, they say, I had a dream, and the revelation of this dream, the truth that I saw in this dream, is that there is a stranger who is no stranger, and this stranger who is no stranger is on his way to Thebes. And if he reaches Thebes, he will become its king and its destroyer. And then David says, Laius raises his eyebrows and says, well, tell me more about these dreams. And so far we're all on the same page, right? So far we narrating the story of David's narrating the story and David's narration, we're all on the same page of what unfolds and happens in this story, in this narratology. At this moment then, David performs this reification that we had introduced in the last couple of pieces. And he says, and David says about Tiresias, and he says, either she or he, but we'll say they. He says that, because they're there to deceive Laius, they tell the dream, or they tell a series of 3 dreams, but they don't tell the dreams that they actually had, because their intention is to deceive the king. And although it's true, right, in this scene, that and as part of the audience, we know that these dreams don't match up with the dreams that Tiresias actually had, and we're aware of that. But what we don't know is the assumption that David makes, that the intentionality, right, of the misrepresentation of these dreams, it is designed, to deceive Laius in order to further Laius's, motivation to encounter Oedipus on the road, and ultimately, right, to remove him as king, and to cause, through this deception, right, his destruction. And the reason that David knows that this is the intention of the discrepancy, between the dream as Tiresias actually has it, the series of dreams as Tiresias actually has them, and the intentionality that they have in telling the dreams this way. David only knows this because of the events that unfold in Act 1, Scene 3, and now correcting, myself in the organization, because I dug out the text from. It had been, as I mentioned, it had been packed away, and I wanted to clarify the order in which these elements of the story are told, and I dug it out of my packing boxes, and to clarify that. And knows this, because of the events that unfold in Act 4, Scene 1. And so here, though, David represents the deception. Now, one could say, well, obviously there's a discrepancy between the way that we've seen the dreams unfold. So there is a kind of knowledge that we have. We have more knowledge about the dreams than Laius has, and we know that Tiresias is misrepresenting. So this is a form of rhetorical deception, but we don't know that it's the form of rhetorical deception that David describes it as being, because he knows the events of the plot that unfold as it unfolds and is presented in the later elements of the play, right? So we could recognize, if we were seeing this play for the first time, we could recognize the discrepancy between the dreams, the three dreams, as we've seen them unfold. If we trust Aristophanes and his presentation on stage, right, as not being a further example of rhetorical deception. Aristophanes could come out and say, "Fooled you." Aristophanes himself could come out and perform a kind of parabasis or parabasis to the audience, like in the manner that the chorus is supposed to perform these parabases, right? In Greek comedy under Thalia, and say, "Fooled you. Those dreams, that we presented, Tiresias as having. Well, they never had those dreams at all. That was a misrepresentation." He could say that, and then, this is us narrating now, not David. But interestingly, the coincidence, right, of the surprise, created a kind of like confluence there. We could even go back to that. Let's go back to that surprise, and because it would represent, right, such a significant moment in understanding, like, the rhetorical contract, right, was being violated. It's like if you're watching a movie and suddenly the movie stopped and said, well, none of this really happened, and this is the way it really happened. And that, now I can't find the moment of surprise. But there it is. Okay, let's see if I can get it. There it is. Okay, hey, that's not the way the dream really happened. And then Aristophanes, says, I wanted to surprise you in Act 2. When Tiresias reached Laius, and in fact and David would have said, he or she, in fact, they misrepresented, their dreams to Diomenia, right? And that would have been a surprise. And that's the way that it could have unfolded, but that's not the way that it did unfold. And because, right, there's no intervening moment in which our kind of contractual agreement, like to follow the conventions of believing in the actions that unfold on the stage, that hasn't been interrupted by this kind of like quirky, redistribution of the aletheia of the conditions under which we're observing the action of the plot, right? Because that hasn't occurred. We feel that we have more knowledge than Laius does, and that is in fact the case. But what we can't assume is that we understand the motivation for Tiresias' deception, and we do know this about Tiresias. We know that Tiresias is concerned with the welfare of Thebes, the people of Thebes, and the demos. And it could very well be that he presents the dreams, in the way that he does, in order to convince Laius of the importance, right? Of the importance of halting this figure who Tiresias, seems to know is Laius' son, and knows, the conditions under which the violation of the taboo, right, will bring the plague, and without informing Laius of all of this that he seems to know, or that we can infer that he knows, right? That he may have, if not entirely the best intentions for Laius, certainly not the kind of deceptive intentions that we learn of later in Act 1, Scene 3, and in Act 4, Scene 1, right? And that's what becomes reified in David's retelling is our understanding that not only is there a discrepancy between the way that the story is presented in Act 1, Scene 1, and the way that it's recounted in Act 1, Scene 2, but that the reason for that discrepancy, right, is to lead, Laius to his own destruction. And that's what we don't know. And that's what we only know later as the action unfolds. But it's hard for us, if we know this story, to forget that in the moment of the recounting, to forget that we know that Tiresias is motivated by his desire to destroy the king, right? Because he knows this, no matter what the outcome of this encounter is, a violation of the sacred will have been made, right? Whether the son kills the father or the father kills the son, right? The demos of Thebes, will still be doomed to the ravages and sufferings caused by this plague. Because in both directions, it's a violation of the sacred bond, between the father and the son, as it's constituted in this moment in Greek patriarchy, right? And so David recounts the story, and from his understanding and knowledge of what occurs later, and that's how he begins. So David says in this moment, and because Tiresias' intention is to destroy both Laius and Oedipus, and replace them, with Creon on the throne as ruler of Thebes, he recounts the three dreams in the following way. And although it's true that he recounts the three dreams, or rather, they recount the three dreams, but David refers to them as he in this moment. But although it's true that they recount the three dreams in the following way, and then David says, because once again, he uses the pronoun she, wishes to deceive Laius, for the and we're correcting him, they wish to deceive Laius for the purpose of removing him from the throne and destroying, both the father and the son, which is true, but not revealed to the audience in this moment, right? Not revealed to the audience in this moment, and it may seem like a minor detail, but the importance bears upon the way that our psychological understanding of narrative, right, must necessarily involve, right, this aspect in which, reification of the elements known to memory and belonging to the story play a part in the unfolding, right? That belongs to the deepest levels of what narrative means. And that plots never simply is an organization of elements, as if, a child were playing with toys. But has everything to do with the psychological internal dramas, right, of the subject presenting the story, as narrative within what is always, always already a new context and new contextualization, new conceptualization of the meaning, right? As David does when he relates the story to the unfolding events and the precipitation, right, of the destruction of democracy in America, beginning in 2016, and the election of Trump by means of the Electoral College, even though in the 2016 he lost the actual majority of the vote. But because of the way that our system here in the United States, favors the Republican Party in the way that voting clout is distributed, and in the way that the overall effect of gerrymandering is distributed, it is becoming increasingly possible and likely, right, to lose the actual popular vote and yet win the electoral vote. And it's increasingly likely and possible that this will happen, in favor of fascist Republican candidates in the future if nothing is done about it. And so that's what's at stake. That's the narrative, in David's terms, at stake in his retelling of what, may or may not simply be a story. But there was also a stake in which it was being retold in Aristophanes' moment on stage as well as for Sophocles, right? Not just to win the prize. We have aesthetic prizes today, but presumably, any artist, motivated by whatever wish fulfillments and anxieties that artists are motivated by, hopefully that those motivations, exceed the rewards of, a Pulitzer or a Nobel, even Nobel, right? Hopefully an artist is motivated by the relationship to and bond, to whatever muse, or if you don't like the image of muse, or find it outdated or too allegorical or too metaphorical, whatever figure you want to put there, right? So it's not such a minor point that that we don't know that yet, that we don't know what's motivating Tiresias's misrepresentation. And after all, this is notes towards a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's varieties, and I'm underscoring this here, varieties of rhetorical deception in narrative and non-narrative storytelling. And certainly the distinction between, misrepresenting a dream in order to motivate a king, to act and maintain, right? Maintain the order of his kingdom, by destroying an interloper, is different from an act of rhetorical deception in which that same individual, in this case Tiresias, is misrepresenting a series of 3 dreams in order to psychologically manipulate the king into engaging in these series of actions that as a prophet, right, the figure of Tiresias can anticipate, which will result in his own demise. And certainly there's a different relationship that we have as an audience to our understanding of these events as they unfold if one imagines that we understand the motivations of Tiresias here, as opposed to becoming aware of the motivations as they unfold in the events of the drama itself, in the events of the plot and the plot's unfolding, right? So we can say this about David's reification. David's reification, supports his own argument earlier that the events of the plot are not important. So his reification, right, by bringing a knowledge of the future that we learn, through the way that the plot is distributed so carefully here, right, like hides the value and importance of the unfolding of the elements of the plot, which are much more than just a movement from the location and the truth of the initial series of dreams and the new location, the palace, and the lie of the dreams as they're retold by Tiresias to Laius. And so in that moment, David continues when after having forecast, in a certain sense, our understanding of the deception here, but really having deceptively hidden the way that this particular deception unfolds, and that's what we're trying to recover, the way that particular deception unfolds. And at that moment, David says that both sides of this split set, that's like a split screen in cinema that has these split backdrops that now coincide with one another, but but begin to transform. And David remarks that. David says, at this point in the narration, Tiresias says, "Well, I'll describe it to you. I'll describe the three dreams. First of all," and then David says, she says, and we'll say, they say. First of all, they say, it was one of those dreams with a split set. And at that moment, David says, Laius looks back at the painted backdrop, and precisely he looks at Laius looks at his side of the backdrop, and then at Tiresias' side of the backdrop, and there's a little kind of seam that's barely visible. You can see that there's a continuity, right, in the two domains, but you can see that there's also a line in that in what separates the two elements of the continuity. Like if you had painted a vertical zip, down a landscape painting, David says, and that that of course gets a laugh from the audience, because it effectively calls attention to the fiction from which this representation is motivated, right? So Tiresias says, it was one of those dreams, where that occurs on a stage, and that gets a laugh, and then that split in half, and then and that gets a laugh, and possibly like there's a deeper motivation to understanding the split stage in relationship to Tiresias that's interesting in terms of the status of this sacred composite prophet as well, and just as the blindness and the seeing of Tiresias places them in this interesting relationship to modalities of our understanding of the visible and the invisible, and so when Laius looks back, we get the laugh, and then just as we get the laugh, and Tiresias goes on, beginning the narration of this dream, then something happens with the set, the actual set. Not the description of the set that's provided by Tiresias, but the actual set that we're observing this action upon. And the set is constructed, David says, of platforms, and these platforms separate, and the one on the left moves further towards the left, and the one on the right moves further toward the right, so that a space opens up, and it's a space in the floor of the stage, and so Tiresias and Laius are now further separated than they had been when Tiresias came to deceptively warn Laius, and that David uses the word deceptively again, and seems to refer back not only to the discrepancy that's about to unfold between our understanding of the dreams as they occurred in scene 1 and as they occur now in scene 2, but like to the function that this way of telling has for Tiresias in relationship to the destruction of Laius, which isn't revealed, and part of our argument is it isn't revealed until the next scene, right? Until scene Act 1, Scene 3, and so from this space, as Tiresias is narrating that in his dream, right, that his dream had this split stage, and he, David says he, or maybe I think at this point he says she, that she, but we'll correct him and say they. But he does, I think, say, if I'm recalling correctly, I think he says she at this point. But whether he says she or they, David says that at this point, they're still narrating the way that in their dream, the meeting between this stranger who becomes king and who destroys the kingdom, is represented in the dream, through this shifting backdrop, and the king, Laius, who is represented in this dream, is also represented, via this unfolding landscape backdrop, and that gets another laugh because again it's calling attention to the fictive, the material construct, that represents the fictive apparatus, and anytime that you call attention to the apparatus, particularly in this comic context, you're bound to get a good laugh. And so the audience is laughing at all this, and Laius once again looks back and starts to observe all of this, and then these two figures emerge in this machine that emerges from below this stage. And it's yet another platform, and this platform rises up, and this platform, itself, right, has a set of backdrops on it that are different, from the from the curtain-like backdrops that unfold on the larger, representation of the stage, that represents on some level the domain of reality, in which Laius and Tiresias are having this conversation, and this backdrop is now. Or this pair of backdrops, right, is now unfolding, and this pair of figures, and one on the left and one on the right, and once again, David points out, and I don't remember, which one is on the left or which one is on the right, and we can point out, once again, it doesn't really matter. Which is represented on the right and which is represented on the left in this instance, and we've already discussed why it doesn't matter, so we'll leave that to the past and just move on. But Laius looks at as these figures are emerging up onto the platform on equal level of their own, and they rise a little bit above the level of the stage upon which Tiresias and Laius are figured and standing. Well, Tiresias is standing, with their walking stick. I was about to say, following David, his walking stick or her walking stick, but they're standing with their walking stick, and Laius is, of course, sitting on his throne with wearing his crown. And the stage, rises up and a little higher than their stage, and Laius in particular, he's observing the distinction between the backdrop, in which he appears in, framed by this this construction of the event and of his meeting with Tiresias, and the narration of the dreams backdrop, into these two segments that are moving, and he keeps comparing them, and the audience laughs, and one of the reasons that the audience might laugh here is because if attention is called to the material construction of the dream, right, as part of the apparatus of representation, one gets a sense that perhaps Laius is concerned with the ontological status of his own reality, that he might not exist in anything other than a dream, as presented on stage, because he sees that just like the dream that's presented in this particular manner, and that has been called attention to by the figure of Tiresias, that he exists in a representational apparatus that is precisely of the same organization and materiality in which this dream occurs. So that might be of some concern. And David makes a joke about it, and he says, and what would really be great, at that point would be if you had, suppose you were doing it, today, and suppose you had the resources available in whatever theatrical situation that you were presenting it in, and simultaneously, like David says, in the moment, right, in the moment that you get this hint that perhaps Laius is questioning the ontological security of his own existence on this stage, which prior to the moment that he recognizes the similarity between these two constructs, his understanding of himself as belonging to like a certain kind of reality hasn't been challenged. Suppose that at this precise moment, like that, a further opening in the architectural design of the theater, right, like separated the audience from this what was perceived as final term of enclosure, right, in relationship to the fourth wall, and that the space of the stage opened up as a kind of like box, open in the front, and the audience could observe, right, like in the background, like that they existed, in these two panels, exactly in the same manner, like that the space that they inhabited, existed in exactly the same manner as this bifurcated, representational construct of space that enclosed, both the dream and the represented reality of the encounter between Tiresias and Laius. I mean, wouldn't that be funny? He says it doesn't happen. He says it doesn't happen in Aristophanes, but it could. You could if you had the resources to do it. He says it could happen, and that might be interesting. And he says, and if you wanted to make a political point, what you could do at that point was you could open up the discourse, by means of this final movement. Like say you were doing it in 2022. He says, you were doing it, sometime in December of 2022, following Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy in America. And you open up this box and you would see, you would see on the left and on the right the terms of the destruction, right? Maybe on the left, and it doesn't matter which side you put him on, he says. Maybe on the left you would see Donald Trump, and maybe on the right you would see Ron DeSantis. And he talks a little bit about Ron DeSantis and the potentiality, of this alternate fascist leader, but essentially, coming from like the same box. It's like, and David talks about the distinction. So you have these. Imagine that, that rather than, he says, imagine, the distinction between Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. But imagine that, instead of, Mussolini belonging to Italy and Hitler belonging to, Germany. Imagine that they were from, some weird fascist producing, over fascist producing country. It doesn't even matter what we call it, he says. But they were. But they were both running, They were both running. there was an election, and there was an election, and you had the opportunity, And this is what and David says, and this is what the primaries are going to be like in 2024 on the fascist side that was once represented by the Republicans, but it's become fascist. And imagine you have this opportunity to vote for Mussolini or Hitler. Well, who are you going to vote for? And then he says, and then he raises his hands, shrugs his shoulders. Well, there's not much difference. Because they're going to destroy the planet and the world and create all this violence and havoc and it's no choice at all. So imagine that the stage opens up. In 2022, and on one side, maybe there are references to Ron DeSantis, and on the other side, there are references to Donald Trump and this encounter, and it's like, it's, and he says it's like Dracula versus the Wolfman. Whoever wins, it's bad. It's bad for everybody, and this is perhaps what. What Tiresias is thinking about Oedipus and Laius, that no matter what happens, we can't win, and so if you know that, if you know that you can't win with Ron DeSantis and you can't win with Donald Trump, David says, well, what do? Well, you want to make sure that neither one of them, win in an election. He says, I'm not saying that, we should send them to the Sphinx, but I'm saying that, since that's not an option, you have to come up with a different solution, right? And that, because that's no choice, and that either this way or that way. You said you're still going to face, you're still going to face all the ravages of that result from the destruction of democracy in America. Because it could just as easily have been, Ron DeSantis' December declaration toward the destruction of democracy in America. Although, I wouldn't have, created the alliteration wouldn't have been as good. And he laughs, and a little out of sync because you can't see him laughing there. He says the alliteration wouldn't have had the same function. But the importance of narrating all this, is to demonstrate, that there are stakes. There are stakes in the telling, and part of those stakes, grow out of the context in which the narrating unfolds, right? So and then he goes back to the unfolding of the action and all the laughing that goes on as these characters emerge. I think we're getting towards the end of the blue screen, and we have to move back right there, and then. And so then a little bit higher than the platform upon which Tiresias and the representation of Tiresias as it's first revealed to us, and the representation of Laius as he's first revealed to us. So the representation of the two characters as they're first revealed to us are on this platform. And then the representation of them within the dream that Tiresias has are on this platform that emerges from below the stage, slightly higher. And so And so then you have two Tiresiases, and you have two Laiuses, and then there's another funny moment, for just a second, or a few seconds, David says, in which, as the first Tiresias is narrating the unfolding of this dream, the second Tiresias is simultaneously narrating the unfolding of the same dream. So you have this kind of overlapping dialogue of these two figures, and that gets a laugh. And you see that you can recognize that this second Laius is Laius. He's not sitting he can't be sitting on his throne, David says, because he has to be walking towards the crossroads, right? And because that's the way that this dream is narrated, as this bifurcated stage setting in which Laius is walking towards the Troipleus Amoxitois, at the fork in the road, the fork in the road, the Troipleus Amoxitois, Daulis toward Delphi, and so is Oedipus. And Oedipus isn't on this platform yet. And that's another surprise that gets a laugh, David says. Because just as they end, and David gets this one right. And I think the reason that he gets this pronoun right and calls them in this particular moment, and he's been shifting back and forth, between him and her and he and she, all this time, is but now there really are two Tiresiases, and both of them are figured on stage, and so it's easy now for David to identify the multiplicity of Tiresias as belonging to to identify the multiplicity and to utilize the pronoun they, because he's actually David, he's actually seeing with his own eyes two separate entities, even though they, right, in a certain sense, are no more they than they ever were, because you have a representation of them within one ontological domain and a representation of them within another ontological domain. But if you take the materiality of the stage, but David's not talking about the materiality of the stage when he utters this line and utilizes they, although he often shifts back and forth between talking about the materiality of the stage and the narrative that it represents. But in the line that he says they, he's actually referring to a reified element of the narrative. And that's interesting because it again, it hides the fact that he recognizes, right, the importance of the material apparatus and its unfolding as plot in relationship to the reification that we can define as narrative or story, right? And so it's an interesting moment, and it's a moment where you would have to say, well, it's the unconscious, trying to tell David, how important, right, the relationship between the material construct of the apparatus is on the stage, the unfolding of the plot, and our understanding of the deep structure of narrative. And so it's important to call attention to it. So he says, so at that point he says, and so there's another funny moment, a point at which they, and the reason that it's a reification of the story and not an account of the materiality of the stage design, is he says they, rip their garb and mask from themselves and reveal that they are actually Oedipus. Well, only one of them does that. Only one Tiresias does that. It's the Tiresias in the dream that once they, right? Once they, both Tiresiases as they and they, both, when both they and they, and this is, our breaking out of David's, recounting of the story, when both they and they, finish their collaborative expression of the last part of this, whatever it is they're saying, to talk about the emergence of the way that the characters are presented in the dream, when they conclude that, then only one of them, only one of the two theys, rips off the garment and reveals that, they are actually the character, that is actually the actor is actually playing the part, or now starts playing the part, I guess, of Oedipus. So David describes, and then they, and he uses the pronoun they rip off their costume and reveal that they're now Oedipus, and begin marching in the direction of Laius on the road. And Laius is marching toward Oedipus, and Oedipus is marching toward Laius, and we don't need a narrator anymore, David says. And the action of the dream, as it's represented in Aristophanes, now unfolds as an engagement, between these two characters. And then David describes what that unfolding is, and that unfolding is this encounter in which Oedipus refuses to get off the road when he's met by the king, and they struggle. They engage in a struggle, and then David describes, and it's kind of comical, and for whatever reason, Aristophanes has them go through all these ballet moves that they went through in the dream that we saw earlier in Act 1, Scene 1, right? And all these references to all these forms. And David is not entirely versed on what all of these forms and shapes represent. And so it's even kind of perhaps more comical than it might be, because he describes the triangles and the squares and the weird abstractions and the various kinds of shapes, and perhaps doesn't recognize all of the ways that these various figures represent elements of the mythos logos and the relationship to the divine feminine, and what Jung would call the alchemical aspects of the mysteries, right? Of the mysteries that they represent, and that are part of the discourse and part of Aristophanes' argument regarding the divine feminine, and part of our understanding of the form and the meaning of the othisi, the analipsi, and the anavasi in all of this, but for David are just these comical forms. And so he goes through all of that, and then he talks about the way that Oedipus defeats Laius, and then mentions that at that point the platform disappears, and Tiresias once again begins narrating, and the platform disappears, and then he says, and that wasn't it, that was just the first dream, it was just the first dream that I had, and there were two more, and but as he's narrating this, then the platform raises once again, but these two figures that represented Laius, the king, and Tiresias are no longer on the platform, but now on the platform is the chorus, the demos, and they're not looking too good. David says they look sick, and they're not happy. And David says, and the chorus, kind of, is represented in this semicircle, for whatever reason. David says, like this semicircle, you know, that's open, you know, at the front, you know, and not a line, you know, facing the audience, and we understand, you know, what the semicircle represents, and its significance in this particular, you know, performance, and again, because perhaps David doesn't recognize the Othisi, the analepsy, and the anavasi, and the argument, you know, regarding the divine feminine, that is the subtext perhaps of the smile of the Sphinx. You know, he doesn't recognize the symbolic significance of it, and therefore doesn't recognize all of the, you know, narrative in the deep sense, narrative structure that belongs to it, right? Like as psychologically important, right, relevant material to involving the relationship between the unconscious and the conscious. And so he says, of course, you know, they're not looking too good, and they say, no, we're sick. And then they tell stories about, you know, the children that they've lost, you know, because of this plague, and their grandmothers, you know, who are afraid to leave their houses, and how there's, you know, like these different levels of lockdown that they have. You know, there's like soft lockdown and hard lockdown, and they have, you know, all these restrictions on activities they can perform. And many people don't have water, and it's difficult to keep sanitary conditions, you know, under all of this, and there's special protocols, and you know, then, and David also talks about the way that, you know, this, if you were doing this, you know, in this period, you know, between, you know, late 19, you know, 19. My mistake. He doesn't say 19. He gets the date wrong. I'm prone to, you know, misremembering numbers and bijective functions, and sequences, you know. But he says, you know, from late 2020 through you know, late 2024, that he says, you know, he, you know, talks about the way that you might want to represent that, you know, this comedy, if you were presenting it, you know, within that period, and how you would draw, you know, the elements from this story, you know, into our experience of this, you know, current and contemporary, you know, context, which you know, David reminds the audience at that point, which is, you know, not our context here, you know, and now, and on October 15, 2003, but, you know, will become, you know, the context of our future, you know. He says, if we're still around at that time, and so the chorus, you know, provides this kind of, you know, it's really, you know, classic parabasis, you know, or parabasis, in you know, as it exists in, you know, Greek comedy, and addresses the audience, right? And they talk about how they're sick, and then the stage, you know, is lowered. The inner stage, you know, that comes up out of the inside of the outer stage is lowered once again, and two figures, you know, come up again, and it's the same two actors, you know, that played the part of the first dream, and it's but something, you know, different, you know, is going on. Well, you know, David says, let's let that unfold as it unfolds. So it's the same two actors that played, you know, the parts in the first dream, and this time, you know, in this particular, at this precise moment, when the stage is emerging, you know, the Laius, the actor who plays the part of Laius, right, is just like the actor, you know, who played the part of Tiresias, or the second Tiresias, in the first dream, you know, began, you know, to utter, you know, the lines in sync with Tiresias. In this scene, the actor who plays the part of the second Laius begins to utter Laius's lines in sync. David says, and those lines. Well, tell me more about the second dream. What happens in the second dream? Now I'm really interested. Well, if this is the case, how do I survive? How do I survive? And both of the actors, playing the part of within the first level of the fiction, the Laius in the first level, and the dream Laius, are speaking in sync. And and then unlike the other one, in which once the synced two Tiresiases stopped talking, that the dream Tiresias ripped off his mask and his costume to reveal that beneath being the dream Tiresias, he was actually Oedipus. That in this one, neither one of the characters, neither one of the characters rips off their clothes or their mask, revealing a different character, inside the dream. But in this one, the second Tiresias, the character playing the Tiresias in the dream, begins speaking, and at first, so does the Tiresias that exists on the level of the fiction of the meeting between Tiresias and Laius, and they're two speaking in sync, and they're recounting the events of the dream. And then the fictive Tiresias at the rhetorical level of the meeting between Tiresias and Laius, outside the dream, stops speaking, and the one inside the dream continues to speak. And at that point, Laius says, "This is getting confusing. Your dream is getting a bit confusing narratologically." He doesn't use the word narratological, but you understand. Whatever the Greek word is, David says that he uses that Laius uses to say, this is getting confusing. It's funny, right? It's pretty funny because you have these characters that are acting simultaneously in these different realms. And in one realm, you just have a representation of the action in the dream, but another one, you have the status where a character is narrating a dream within a dream, to a narrational character, and that's fascinating in a certain way. And so that gets a laugh. And then what you have, is this character, that plays the dream fictive. You have this character that plays the dream fictive Tiresias, right? Speaking to the dream fictive Laius, but it's weird because he's David says he again, and then he switches to she, and we'll just say they. But it's weird because they're within the same rhetorical fictive construct that represents the dream. But they're discussing the dream itself. And then David says, and it gets even weirder because there's a point at which then, this dream Tiresias, stops addressing the dream Laius and begins, turning in the direction of the non-dream Laius that exists on the broader side, and performing this weird kind of like fictive, ontological border crossing, and at first, well, he says, well, Tiresias is blind, so it's not so obvious that he's looking in, just looking in the wrong direction. But then it becomes, more and more apparent that, as he kind of turns the direction of his head, from one laus to another, that he's addressing both of these lauses. And what are you going to do with that? He says, but in this one, rather than representing the dream, as a kind of a analepsis, right? A kind of like analepsis that represents a deceptive dream, like because you recall, David says that the dream isn't the dream that Tiresias actually had, so it's not a real analepsis, but it's like a deceptive analepsis. It's like he's telling you that I had this, but it's not, it's a deception and it's a lie in a certain sense, right? But what does it represent? Well, it represents, he has to deceive the king because his intention is to destroy him, because he knows that whoever wins this, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whoever wins this struggle. That it's either going to be it's either going to violate the sacred because the child killed his father, or it's going to violate the sacred because the father killed the child. So he has to destroy both of them, and he uses he again and again, and we're just going to say they. And we've already talked about, how that's drawing upon knowledge, from what David knows of the future, and how it's not really what we understand is unfolding here, and so that it misses a level of rhetorical deception that's important to the story as it unfolds, and important to the plot in a way that, David's argument about the plot being unimportant kind of elides and omits and masks, right, in terms of the significance of all of what unfolds. And so he says, but in this part, the action is the action of the second dream is just narrated, and he says, And he says, in this part, he tells, and at the point he says, and in this part of the dream, in your struggle with this stranger who becomes king and destroys Thebes, he says, you succeed. You succeed in the struggle, and you defeat. And you defeat the stranger and this destroyer of the demos. And then it's interesting because the dream Tiresias at this point crosses his half, David says, and then he says crosses his half, crosses her half, crosses his half, crosses her half, and as we have been doing, we'll say crosses their half. At this point, the dream Tiresias crosses their half of the split stage and comes over to the laus side of the stage. And that gets another laugh for whatever reason. I think just because of the complexities of the organization of space-time and the symbolic values in terms of the layers of rhetorical fiction that are assigned to those domains, that any kind of crossing now represents like this calling attention to the apparatus and to the constructs of the fiction, and also calling attention to all of like the domains under which, you know, the symbolic values of the fiction are maintained, right? And so, you know, anything now that calls attention to any aspect of the apparatus gets a laugh, and because it's so profoundly destabilizing, right? You know, David points out. And so, so at this point, Tiresias, you know, crosses the stage, and he says, you know, and in this struggle, in this second dream, you know, you killed the stranger, you won. And in that moment, you know, as Tiresias is crossing and just completing the crossing, then the dream Laius, you know, crosses over to the side on which Tiresias, the dream Tiresias, had been, and it's the same side that the non-dream Tiresias is on. So the two figures in the dream, you know, switch sides, you know, of this, you know, split stage. That's a stage inside, you know, the split stage on the outside of the dream. And just, you know, as that occurs, then the Tiresias, you know, on the fictional you know, part of the stage that doesn't represent the dream, starts narrating once again. And what he, you know, and the moment that he begins narrating the third dream, then the Tiresias that is inside the dream, on whatever side that is, on the left or the right of the split stage, you know, rips off, you know, the mask and the costume that he has, just like he did in the first dream. So now we're entering into the third dream, and but this time, you know, he's not Oedipus. He's David says, or we think we're entering into the third dream. But it turns out, you know, it turns out that we're not, and then there's a little confusion, and the king Laius, on whatever side he's on, says, wait a minute, you know, is this because when he sees Tiresias, you know, ripping off his mask and his costume and revealing like that he's now playing the figure of the Sphinx. He says, wait a minute. So the Tiresias on the outside says, wait a minute, is this still the second dream, or are we in the third dream? And then the figure on the outside, you know, Tiresias on the outside, who's not in the dream, and the figure Tiresias, who's in the dream, simultaneously say, no, we're still in the second dream. And that, of course, gets a great laugh. And both Laiuses, the one in the dream and the one outside the dream, at that point, you know, they shrug their shoulders, and the audience, you know, bursts out in comical laughing, because it's so completely, you know, destabilizing and funny, you know, obviously that you know, that the house goes wild, you know, David says at that point. You know, generally the house goes wild at that point. And sometimes someone might say, like, it's like, where's Diomedea? Like, where's the interpreter? Like, we need some help interpreting all of this, right? Keeping track of all this information. Where's Diomedea? And if that happens, David says, then you get more laughter, right? So the two Laiuses are shrugging their shoulders, and the two well, you can't really say that there are two Tiresiases anymore, because one Tiresias is now a Sphinx, because the Tiresias that, and David says her, the Tiresias that ripped off her, David says, would say their clothes, and revealing that they're the Sphinx in this second dream, at the same time that they were speaking in sync with the Tiresias on the outside. You can't really say they're two Tiresiases anymore, because now the Sphinx and the Tiresias are talking account. No, this is still a second dream. Like, it begins with, no, this is still the second dream, while Tiresias is still Tiresias within the dream. But by the time, like, that Tiresias ends that sentence, that statement, and informs both of the Laiuses, then the Tiresias is now the Sphinx. And so then at that point, that's the last line, that this actor, who's playing, Tiresias inside the dream, has in sync with the Tiresias outside the dream. And at that point, the Tiresias outside the dream, begins to narrate the story, and narrates the story over the action that unfolds, in the representation of the Sphinx and the and the character playing the character playing Laius, right? And that's comical too, David says, because the actions don't quite sync up. It's like if someone were narrating what I'm narrating right now, David says, but someone were narrating that I was like making a gesture with my hand, but maybe I wasn't making a gesture with my hand. Or someone was narrating that I was smiling, like cleverly, and in this way that expressed like that I was very pleased with myself, but maybe I wasn't doing that. That would be funny, David says. Or maybe I was doing something with my hands, that I like spreading them apart and like putting something over here, or gesturing, like an opening up of some kind, and I wasn't really doing that, or placing something in the sky in some abstract way, but I was really, but instead I was scratching my forehead, or my nose, or I was covering my eyes, or I was walking menacingly with my hands outstretched, and that would be funny, and that's the kind of humor that's produced, right? As this Tiresias, who's outside the dream, is narrating the actions simultaneously as the actions are being performed by these characters, but simultaneously, like, out of sync, like this asynchronous action and narration. And he says, and remember, this is still the second dream. And in the second dream, he says, what happens? Well, in the first dream, you got away with killing the stranger, but in the second dream, you're not so lucky. And all of this is going on, and he says, and the Sphinx, has these riddles, and this is what the Tiresias outside the dream is narrating, and we're seeing, that already, the Sphinx is devouring, the defeated, remains of Laius. But he says, she has these riddles, and if you don't know the answer to the riddle, she's going to kill you. So you survived. You survived, the encounter with this stranger, but then in this second dream, you're killed by the Sphinx. And she says, and he tells him the riddle that she asked. She says, she's got this riddle, and she goes, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, what walks on 2 legs in the afternoon, and what walks on three legs in the evening. And Laius says, an ostrich, and Tiresias is, this is the Laius, outside of, this is the Laius outside of the dream, because inside the dream, the when she asks, the question inside the dream, and the moment that she asked the question, the moment that Tiresias is narrating, her asking the question, she lifts her head up, from where she's munching the bones and devouring the flesh of the vanquished and defeated king in the dream, and simultaneously speaks and asks the question. That they were scratching his head because it gets confusing, but simultaneously asks the question. She lifts her head up, and her mouth has got blood on it, and she asks the question, what has, even though we already know that, obviously we already know that he didn't get the right answer, or she wouldn't be munching on him, or at least the way that she is in Tiresias's depiction, David says, because we know that this isn't the actual dream, right? We know what the actual dream was, and simultaneously, with the narration of Tiresias, she says, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, what walks on 2 legs in the afternoon, and what walks on 3 legs in the evening, and just as, and then they're in sync there. Tiresias and the Sphinx are in sync, and then just as just as it's Tiresias, right, narrating the response, the Tiresias outside the dream narrating the response of the Laius inside the dream, and just as the Tiresias outside the dream is narrating the response of the Laius inside the dream, when we're reaching the end of David's talk, so I have to go back. So try that. Then Laius, or what's left of Laius, right, in this depiction, the Laius that the Sphinx has been chewing on, then lifts his head at that point, and simultaneously, when Tiresias is saying the answer through the mouth of Laius in her, David says, he starts to say him, but then says her, because I think he says her at this point because he's associating the Tiresias who's outside the dream speaking now with this figure of the Sphinx, who David associates with the form of a feminine figure, female. So says her. He begins to say him, but then he stops and he corrects himself and says her. So the Tiresias outside the dream, they, as they're uttering, what Laius's answer is to this question, which is an ostrich, right? At the same time, then, and for whatever reason this is his answer, the Laius that's being chewed upon, by the Sphinx in the dream, raises his head and says a rhinoceros, and David says, and that's interesting because then and he says, it's interesting in relationship to the future of the absurd, that it's a rhinoceros, and perhaps, I don't know, I don't know, but maybe that's where Ionesco gets the idea, for the selection of the rhinoceros is from this moment in Aristophanes. He says, listen, we won't go into all of that here, but it's an interesting point to speculate regarding, and of course at that moment when Laius gets the answer so wrong and gets it wrong as it's spoken, as the answer is spoken by the narrating subject Tiresias outside the dream, and at this character who comically comes back to life just for the purpose of uttering this incorrect response that led to his demise in the first place. That gets a huge laugh out of the audience as well. And then the Tiresias outside this dream and says and that was the end of the second dream. But just as that Tiresias is narrating that, the stage lowers and then the stage rises once again, and then rather than having David explains that rather than the presentation on that platform, that rising and lowering platform, rather than those two actors, you once again see the chorus, and the chorus is once again representing the demos, and the demos is once again informing the audience in the form of a classic parabasis that everyone's still sick, and that's funny too, even though the content isn't funny, but the way that it's presented is funny, because they tell exactly the same stories that they told about all of these deaths due to this plague in the first presentation, right? So they say we're still sick, and then each one of the members of the chorus in their various voices and with their various manners and in their various depictions of like the sickness that is the result of this plague repeats exactly the same story. And then as that lowers, then the Tiresias outside the dream says and at this point the Laius outside the dream is standing or sitting rather, but has his mouth open in horror and shock and terror, and the Tiresias, which also gets a laugh, and then the Tiresias outside your dream says but that's not all, don't despair too much, because there is a third dream after all, and I stepping out of David's narration for a second, I would really like to complete that dream today, but I have to. But we here in our ontological reality need to check the time that it's taken us to record the David's reading elaboration and interpretation of Aristophanes' reading elaboration and interpretation of this story in this second act of the Smile of the Sphinx, and in this particular part of the second act in which Tiresias tells and Laius the story of these three dreams and their significance, and interprets their significance for him. I need to check how much time we've spent on this, because if it's too long, I won't be able to transfer it into my computer and to put it up on YouTube. So as much as I would like to complete the telling today, and we may come back and find that we have plenty of time, and if that's the case, we'll go ahead and at least finish the telling of the third dream as it's misrepresented to Laius, and as it's misrepresented by David in his recounting of it, but I doubt that's a possibility. I think perhaps we may have to keep the third dream in abeyance for yet another reading.